Hi, this week's episode of The Transformationist is a deeply personal one, as we've had a diagnosis in my own family of dementia that has drastically changed the shape of our family life. This week's guest, Kyrin Bhula, also had her life dramatically changed when her mother was diagnosed with Alzheimer's, and then in her late 20s, Kyrin became her full-time caregiver. This conversation is deeply personal, reflective, and I hope an invitation to greater sympathy, empathy, and awareness of what it means to be a caregiver for those that we love. If you or someone in your family or someone you care about is either facing or dealing with what it means to be a caregiver or to suffer with Alzheimer's or a dementia-related disease, please reach out to the Alzheimer's and dementia organisations and associations in your area. They do have resources to help. Are you thirsty for inspiration and curious about the life-changing process of transformation? Welcome to The Transformationist. Whether you already know the transformation you're looking for or you're looking for guidance on the way there, these stories of hope will give you practical tips, plenty of encouragement, and an invitation into real, life-giving transformation, whether you're transforming culture or becoming more yourself. Your story is welcome here. On this week's episode of The Transformationist, it's a real privilege to have Kyrin Bhula join us on this show to talk about an incredibly personal, painful, but also inspiring journey. Kyrin is a small business owner, a counsellor, and also a full-time caregiver to her mother, Martha. Martha was diagnosed in 2009 with Alzheimer's, and since 2013, Kyrin has been her full-time caregiver, an amazing journey for a daughter to go on with a mother. And I just want to thank you and honour you for being prepared to come onto the show and share some of your experience. So thank you so much and welcome to The Transformationist.
Thanks for having me.
I think there's probably a bit of a common perception that Alzheimer's is something that affects older people and affects older people across the board. But you're actually, how old were you when Martha was diagnosed?
I was like 25, I think, when she was diagnosed. Would that make sense? No, I must have been like 23. But she had probably had symptoms about 2 years before she was actually diagnosed. It was just a long process to diagnose.
Right. And so what was life like at the time? Had you moved away from home? Were you studying, or just, tell us a little bit about the before. That's usually the invitation I like to offer.
Yeah, so I think at the time I was living in Auckland. I was working for Women's Refuge, and I was just living this life where, like a really good single life. And then, and I didn't really have much to do with Martha at that stage. Like, I was in my early adulthood, and so I didn't go home very often. We didn't have much interaction. And then I actually ended up moving to Christchurch after the earthquakes to do some work down there, and then kind of really didn't have anything to do with her. Again, was just living this really standard kind of life as a social worker with kind of no cares in the world.
Mm. Yeah. And so what then... what was your first sort of response like when the diagnosis happened? Were you suspicious that something was already going on, or did it come as a surprise? I guess I asked that question out of my own family story. When we received a diagnosis of dementia, it didn't really come as a surprise at that point, because we'd already noticed some things that were happening. But what was it like for you?
Yeah, I don't think it was a surprise, because there had been a lot of things happening, and the diagnosis actually came out she was asked to retire, and then her retirement was medical retirement because of her Alzheimer's, and that's kind of how she got diagnosed. And leading up to that, there had been quite a few things where it's like these aren't normal things anymore. Like we all forget where our car keys are and things like that, but it was just happening too often. But I think when she was actually diagnosed, I was like living this great life. And so I was in a lot of denial about it. And because I was angry and hurt and didn't really understand what was happening. And yeah, I guess I wasn't surprised, but there was a lot of denial involved.
How long and where did that journey of denial take you?
So I probably tried to deny it, like even when I became a full-time carer, I was probably still in a bit of denial about it. I do remember we went to India, my mum and my dad and myself, and during that time was probably the first time where it became really crucial that actually Martha has Alzheimer's, because she ended up getting lost one day on a walk.
Oh no.
And India is not the place that you want to get lost. And so that was probably the time where it really hit home, like, okay, this is serious and not just like a casual, she's kind of forgetting things now. Yeah.
Because I guess that's because, the story that we know, or the narrative that we know of Alzheimer's or any of the kind of dementia related diseases is the forgetting of things. But actually, when you start to forget things, all sorts of other things also then start to unravel, including your ability to look after yourself. And so tell me a little bit about what led then to you're now living back in Auckland, and you are Martha's full-time caregiver. Tell me a little bit about the story, or what happened, and how you came to be doing that now.
Yeah, cool. So my dad passed away in June 2013, and like the day he passed away, I became Martha's full-time caregiver. So up until that point, he had been caring for her. And I was actually living in Christchurch at the time. So like immediately flew up to Tauranga where my parents were living. And at that stage, Martha was still quite well. Like she was still able to do a lot of things for herself. And but the kind of plan at that time was to find like a assisted living for Martha. And me, I was like, cool, I get to return to my really easy life in Christchurch, and Martha will be in assisted living. And then kind of like the more I looked into that with her over the next few months after my dad passing, I wasn't coming up with any really good solutions. And Alzheimer's is like a degenerative disease. So at that point, you don't actually know what stage she will get to or what level of care she will need. And it was really hard predicting that. So we ended up moving to Christchurch. Her and we sold like our family home in Tauranga. And we moved to Christchurch, and we kind of did all these fun things. Like I left my job and we did a lot of traveling. And then I still kind of had in mind that I wanted to put her into somewhere full time. But like the further I got down the track of actually being her caregiver, the harder that reality came for me. And I guess like my attachment to her grew even more. And then we kind of just, like I was kind of just resigned to the fact that like, yeah, I will be her caregiver now. And then we ended up leaving Christchurch. I moved to Auckland for a job. and kind of never left.
So tell me a little bit about what were the things that made it difficult for you to relinquish her care? What was it that sort of struck a note in you or started to overtake the desire to get back to, some semblance of what a normal life had been before?
That's a good question. There was probably quite a few contributing factors. I don't know that looking in Christchurch for like a full-time care for her was a good idea, and because I was living in Christchurch, that was kind of my option. But Christchurch and Tauranga are so different, and like the populations are really different, and so I just wasn't finding like the cultural match for Martha there. And then there was also, I guess I left home when I was 18 and I moved like a really long way away from my parents. And I kind of realized I'd never actually had a relationship with Martha as my mother, like as an adult.
Right. So, yeah. Okay.
Yeah. We didn't have a relationship. Like I would see her, 4 times a year, or maybe even less than that. But I think I became invested in having this relationship with her and trying to grow from that. And then as the time went on, that relationship changed, and I've become very attached to her. And so, like, letting her go into full-time care just became a harder and harder thought process, and it became very painful. And for a time, my entire identity became wrapped up in being a caregiver. And so the thought of like handing that over became like almost impossible.
Can we talk about that then for a minute? Because obviously, I mean, you're involved vocationally in caring for people. You had trained and were working as a social worker, and so did that transition to then caring for your mum? Was that an easy one, to make, or was it different because it was caring for your mum?
Yeah, I think it was probably easy because it's in my nature to do so. So yeah, like my whole career has been dedicated to supporting people and helping people. And I guess I didn't maybe anticipate like the difficulties of being a carer. And so it was just kind of this really easy thing to do at the start. Although in saying that, I had a lot of people saying, like, you need to put her into care. And there was almost like a defiance in wanting to care for her as well. Like, no, I'm going to prove you wrong. Like, I can do this and this is my life.
Is that a cultural thing?
Time again, I find myself in caring roles, and I'm a counsellor now. And again, it's like a repetition of a caring role.
And so you talked about for a time all of your identity being wrapped up and being Martha's caregiver. Are you talking about that in a way that, did it become unhealthy at a certain point, and have you had to adjust your sense of, who you are in relation to caring for Martha, but also being Martha's daughter, but also being, your own independent person? What's the tangle of identity? Because I imagine it's still probably shifting and changing.
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, still it occurs where like my identity becomes very wrapped up in her, but there was probably about a 6-month period in my life. I lost a job, and a lot was going on in my life, and kind of like my sole purpose was to care for Martha, and it did become very unhealthy, and she became like my only protective factor in the world, because I thought, oh, if I'm not caring for her, what else would I do, and who am I, and what's even the purpose of being here? And I don't feel like that anymore, but I certainly do have aspects sometimes where I get so immersed in her life and advocating for her that I really forget who I am and what I have to offer. And I become quite resentful of that. And people often put Martha's needs ahead of mine, or like a lot of the focus goes towards her. So it's easy to get caught up in the narrative of like, you are just a caregiver,
right?
Not, you're a woman, you have a business, you're a counsellor, you're a friend, you're all these other things as well.
Is it? I mean, as I listen to you talk, I hear parallels with friends of mine who talk about raising young children and how they lose themselves in the role of mother. Have you felt any of those sort of similarities? Do those parallels draw true for you?
Yeah, definitely. In conversations that I've had with parents, like, oh yeah, I totally understand that loss of identity, and like all you're doing is giving to this one thing that is maybe at times seems quite ungrateful, or is quite difficult to continue to do, but you actually don't have a choice.
So I wanted to ask, do you think it's, when you talked about people encouraging you or demanding of you that you should put Martha in full-time care? I mean, and going back to 2013, that's quite a long time ago now, and certainly, you talked about the unpredictability of the disease and how it's hard to know exactly what stage somebody will be at. But do you think, is it a cultural expectation? Is it just a mandate of the health system that we live in, that was people's first response or priority in terms of how caring for Martha should go?
Yeah, I think I think all of that. I think definitely a cultural response. My aunt, she really encouraged me to put Martha into care, and she had actually put her own mother into care, and I know that there was like a bit of friction around that. So yeah, I think there's like this cultural response that, yeah, we do, like, this is the way society runs, and we just put people into care who have Alzheimer's, because Alzheimer's is a really difficult disease. I think what people don't understand is like all the beautiful things that come from Alzheimer's, and there's only focus on the negative. But I definitely think we're a society that is designed to put people into care and not care for them in the home.
And do you think your ethnic background contributes to that as well, or is it the same whether or not people are white or of Pacific Island or Indian descent? Does it make a difference, or do you think it's just carte blanche, that's what we do?
I do think it makes a difference. I think, like, when you look at Pacifica whānau, they will often care for people in the home. And same with Māori. But I think New Zealand our society very much pushes people to put them into care with no real reason, but just that, like, that's the normal thing to do, and that's what we've done for a long time, so we should just do that. And then, but there's on the flip side of that, there's a lot of maybe cultural shame if you do decide to do that, if you do decide to put them into care. So it's kind of like this weird lose-lose situation.
A really unfortunate lose-lose, which I think is, and we only have, I guess, the experience of the culture within which we live, right, to compare it to. So I don't know what what it would be like in other parts of the world. But certainly, certainly that seems, it's a curiosity to me to understand what plays into that as being a cultural norm. You mentioned and talked about that there are aspects of Alzheimer's that are beautiful that often get overlooked and the focus on the negative. And I want to talk about that, but I'd love to talk about it through, I guess, understanding a little bit of what your journey as a caregiver has been like. And perhaps, maybe you could describe what it was like in the beginning to be a caregiver, and what that journey of caregiving has looked like as time has passed, and how it's changed.
Yeah. So in the beginning, it was I was dealing with the grief of losing my dad, and that was a really hard grief to work through, because Martha and I weren't experiencing grief in the same way.
And did Martha, was she cognizant enough at that point that she knew that her husband had passed, or how was that for her?
Yeah, immediately she did know, but I mean, one of the things with Alzheimer's is like trauma can often affect how quickly you go downhill, and so very quickly, I would say within 3 months, she kind of had maybe disconnected from him in quite a big way. And so while I was still going through this huge grieving process, she wasn't in that space anymore. And wouldn't even kind of know that he was her husband at times, or
Wow.
or would forget that he had passed away, which is like a really difficult conversation to have with somebody.
And especially when you are in the midst of that grief process yourself, to have to relive that element of trauma is I can imagine really, really challenging.
Yeah. And then and because those conversations highlight like, oh, you've got Alzheimer's. Great. I've already lost a parent physically, and now I'm losing one emotionally and mentally and all of that side. So yeah, that was a really difficult kind of first 3 months, I guess, of grieving for my father and being a caregiver. And then we had like maybe about a year where I left my job, and it was amazing because I'd never not worked.
Right.
And we just had we had so much fun. We did a lot of traveling. We went to like America and Europe, and we spent a lot of time together. And Martha was really capable at this stage. And so her memory loss was frustrating, but I wasn't like in this full on caring role where I was having to do things for her all the time. She was still able to kind of like help herself and do dishes and be left alone for good periods of time. So I still kind of maintained...
So did that Sorry, go on.
I still kind of maintained a level of independence in our relationship.
Yeah, that was what I was going to ask about. That ability to care for someone but not be entirely consumed by their needs.
Yeah.
So when did that start to change?
We moved to Auckland, and that was probably quite a big trauma for her as well, just like the shifting. And when we finally moved to Auckland, we kind of moved around a lot, so we weren't anywhere stable, and that was for about 6 months that we were here. And so I think there was a lot of trauma around that time for her, and the not knowing what we were doing. And I really started to notice she would go downhill. She went downhill quite rapidly during that time, and needed to have help like showering and dressing. Asked a lot more questions on repeat, so it was almost like relentless sometimes, the amount of questions she would ask. And I was also working at the time, so I was dealing with the stress of work and the stress of her as well.
And I think that's another one of the misnomers, perhaps, is that when we think about Alzheimer's and we think about who bears the brunt of that frontline caregiving, I think we often think about it as being, husbands or wives, where one partner is suffering from the disease and the primary caregiver is usually, at that stage, able to devote a reasonable amount of time to care. They're not necessarily in a career building mode or in a study mode or any of those aspects, and so quite different then to be. I mean, what made it possible, or what were the challenges that you had to overcome to be able to even be working and still be caregiving for Martha at that time?
So I had a really good support network, which was amazing. And I had some really close key friends who were really supportive, because the other thing for me is I'm an only child, so I don't have any whānau support. And Martha's whānau are all older as well, so they weren't available. And my dad's family, they don't live in Auckland, so whilst they were great support, through Messenger and phone calls, they couldn't physically support us. So I had some great friends, and we were having carers come in every day into the house to help care for Martha, do her, help her shower, help her get dressed, help her have breakfast. And then she also belongs to this incredible day program, which she's been going to for 5 years now, or 4 years, which, she goes there almost every day from 9 till 3. So that was a huge weight off my time, was being able to take her to that.
Yeah. That's remarkable. And so what does caregiving for Martha look like now? How I mean, I've enjoyed being able to go in and grab coffee and a drink with you, and Martha is part of that kind of daily experience. But she's no longer super speech forward, right?
Yeah.
And so how has that transition been for you?
It's one of those things where you don't know it's happened until somebody really points it out to you.
Right.
Because I'm so close to it, I don't actually see all the big changes, and so I just get really used to what's happening. And Martha and I have kind of our own language in the way that we communicate. And so, it's interesting to look back and be like, oh, yeah, so maybe, 2 years ago she lost the ability to speak in full sentences. And so that's been quite challenging. And she's gone downhill a lot. I do most things for her these days. And I remember when I kind of first started caring and during the journey, I would set these kind of milestones, okay, when this happens, I'll think about putting Martha into care. And then that thing happens and you don't actually have time to decide in that moment, I need to put Martha into care at this stage. You kind of just get on and do it. So Martha needs full support, with all of her showering, eating, toileting, getting dressed, everything. And I guess I had set this benchmark of, when she needs help toileting, I would consider putting her into care. But that time has come and gone, and I'm still caring for her because I'm just so used to it now. Yeah.
And so, what are some of those things that you speak of that are the beautiful moments that have come through this journey that you wouldn't have had to experience, or you wouldn't have had the opportunity to experience if you had put her into care all those years ago?
Yeah, there are so many things, and it makes me quite emotional to like think and reflect on that. Because for sure, if I wasn't caring for Martha, I would most likely be living in Christchurch, working in this really average job, and living this life that was fine, but it was by no means fulfilling. Um, and I was living like this quite emotionally detached life where that made me really, really good at my job because I was dealing with some really terrible things. But I also didn't have a lot of emotional feeling day to day. And so I guess that's like been the biggest gift from this experience of being her caregiver is like I've actually had to learn how to deal with my emotions and have them and experience like the lowest of lows but the greatest of highs. And I've had like the time to connect with myself and figure out who am I as a person, which like I started working when I was 15 and kind of was on the pathway to just continue working. And maybe I would be the manager at where I was working now, but it wouldn't have been this kind of fulfilled life that I have now, where I'm completely in touch with who I am. And Martha and I have this really beautiful relationship that is at times challenging, but it's kind of like more than I could have ever hoped for from a relationship, I think, with my parent as an adult. Yeah, and like I've just been witness to some really beautiful things through Martha. I've witnessed her communication with God and like in this real spiritual realm that I guess like that's a real gift to me, and maybe sounds like weird for people, but I've certainly been, a witness to the presence of God through Martha. And that's been really life changing, like literally changed my life and who I am as a person was her connection with the spiritual realm. I so desperately needed in my life. And so, like, by her kind of losing all of the bullshit of of the thoughts and the clutter of our minds, and by having this kind of mind that doesn't have anything like that, she's connected only to love most of the times, and I get that. Like I'm the direct receiver of that, and that's incredible. Like that's so powerful. Yeah.
So, I mean, describe, because most people listening to this episode will have never met Martha, but perhaps you could. I mean, can you describe her, because she's a woman like I've never met, probably, in terms of, and even though we've never shared sentences. In the moments that I've spent time with Martha, she really is just full of joy and laughter, and but yeah, maybe can you describe her?
Yeah, maybe I can try. I think I'm really lucky because Martha is so happy, and that's not always the case for people who have Alzheimer's. There can be a lot of anger. But yeah, I guess, how would I describe her? Like for me, it's like the only thing that she knows is love and kindness and happiness. And that just like constantly runs through her entire body all the time. And so she's totally happy to hug strangers and look people directly in the eye and hold them. And it's just like there's something so warm and inviting about her. And I think that's what it would be like if you were to think of Martha. It would just be like the person that you most enjoyed seeing because they were so warm and open would be how I would describe Martha. Yeah.
What do you think? What do you think has helped you to journey through this space? We spoke a little bit about the unraveling and then the recreation of your identity and how that ebbs and flows through this journey. And we talked about the support networks and just in the last few minutes you've started to sort of touch on how it's changed you as a person, and perhaps how life is different now than what it would have been. But what do you think some of the lessons are, or the things that you've realized along the way that have actually helped you navigate?
I think one of the big things for me was I was like I'm not really religious, but I'm a spiritual person. Like that was kind of my narrative. And I think like through caring for Martha, I was able to maybe articulate that better and realize like, oh, we're not alone. It's not just us here. There is some type of divine intervention, creation that is here supporting us. And like all of those Tumblr quotes about like, nothing's a coincidence and like, this is your path and all that is like, it's true. And I think being able to like realize that, like, oh, this is actually the thing that you're meant to be doing. Like this was destined for you and you're supported in a way that is, more than this physical realm is what has enabled me to continue at this point in my life. And then just like the pure joy that I get from being with Martha and being with somebody who only knows love. And we have our challenging times, but like knowing that I probably won't actually experience that again from anybody else, that keeps me motivated to continue, because like what a joy, what a gift to have something like that given to me. Like why do I get that? Why do I deserve that? And it comes with the challenges of being a caregiver, but it also comes with like those beautiful things about connection and understanding like what love is and understanding what the universe means and what it wants from me.
Do you think that those lessons and insights, are they setting you up for a future that has to inevitably at some point no longer include Martha, present day to day?
Yeah, definitely. And when I look at kind of the work that I do and the business that I run, I can kind of start to see the threads of all of it in there, and how actually I use, my skills as a caregiver to be a counsellor, and how I really use love to fuel my business, which are all things that like I've needed to cultivate, because I know that one day I'll be in a life without Martha, but I still need her essence to exist within me. And I guess these are the ways that I capture that and like allow her legacy to live on through me. Yeah.
Do you think about the future a lot?
I try not to, depending on what moon phase we're in. Yeah, I think it's one of those things where I'm quite excited about the future, which is a nice change. I wasn't always excited about it. A future without Martha seems like impossibly hard at this stage. But I know that I'm being given the resources to live a life without her anyway, and without her like earthside, because I know she'll always be there in some capacity anyway. I think again, coming back to like my identity being so wrapped up in being a caregiver will be a real huge adjustment. And even when she goes into respite care, after about 3 days, I get a bit like antsy about, oh, what am I doing? What should I be doing? So I think there'll be a really big adjustment stage for me. But I do think about the future, and I'm looking forward to it, which is refreshing.
I think it's really beautiful. I'm curious as to whether or not you think have you, as we talk, and I'm probably even more reflective in this interview than I am in so many of the conversations that I have. But I think partly because there's a spaciousness to this conversation, because there's so much grief in it, but there's also so much joy. But I'm curious, do you think it's a privilege to have the opportunity to perhaps both live and love and grieve, with your parent before eventually losing them? That's just something that occurs to me as, perhaps it's more of a gift in a culture that really struggles to deal with death or to deal with, passing. I'm curious as to whether or not you feel grateful for having had the extra time to be able to, process and then really live with Martha.
Yeah, 100%. I feel extremely grateful to be given like such an introduction into life, and to have this beautiful relationship with my mum, which I wasn't going to have. If she was well, we weren't going to have this relationship, because I would have been living my life and she would have been living hers. And I get to live and love with her and discover the parts of myself that are also the parts of her. And yeah, I think that's a truly beautiful gift. I mean, Alzheimer's sucks, and I wouldn't wish that on anybody. But I think if you can embrace it and accept it and move with it, it will offer you more than you've ever expected in your entire life. And that, like, yeah, you will always learn something from it. And that's like truly incredible. I'm so grateful for the lessons that I've learned and continue to learn all of the time.
Yeah, that's amazing. What's the support structure like now in terms of, do you still feel, because you're young, you're so young. Yeah. and I mean that in a super flattering way, but you really are so young for being somebody who is a primary caregiver. Do you feel like you have a place of belonging amongst the community of people, the community of caregivers, whether that's in Auckland or the broader community?
I do and I don't. I've really struggled in Auckland to find that community, and I probably don't in Auckland actually have a community of caregivers or people in my position that support me. But I do have incredible friends who are always there to talk to me about what's going on. I think like social media has been amazing, and I built some incredible connections because of social media. And I think that has been the way that I've been able to connect with other carers who are young as well and in my position, to support each other and to be like, oh my gosh, like this thing is shit or this thing is amazing. That's probably been my biggest way of connecting with other caregivers, I would say. Yeah.
yet like so important to find those connections and to find those similarities, or those, just the opportunity to be able to complain about the same stuff at the end of the day.
100%.
Too funny. So you decided to launch a business in the midst of all of this, because you are, from my perspective anyway, a wonderful example of somebody who is brilliantly alive and engaged in the act of living, despite a circumstance that is perhaps trying. What was the inspiration behind deciding to start a business? At the same time, you're, that you've got so much on your plate, and you decided that you wanted to start a business too.
My business was an interesting start. It kind of stemmed from a very spiritual experience, which again was something that really changed my life. When it came into it, and I was kind of maybe forced into starting this business by the universe. Like, it was kind of like, you have to do this thing.
The universe is coercing you.
Yeah. And I guess I talk about it in terms of, I lived quite a few years after my dad passed away, whilst I was being a carer, not really living. I was just existing, and at times I was barely existing. And when I kind of made the decision to, like, hey, I've actually made a choice about caring for Martha now, because it had been this thing that had been forced upon me, and I made the decision, like, you're going to be her carer. That was like the shift for me, where I was like, cool, I actually get to catch up on all the life that I missed for a couple of years. And I'm still catching up on that, like those few years where I did nothing that filled my soul up. And starting a business was one of those things.
Isn't it? I just think it's such an interesting conundrum. It's a paradox, but it's a beautiful one. That in living through such an experience, and just being responsive and leaning into what was in front of you, that you've actually come back to life, or learned to live in an entirely different way. And I think that's a real gift, and I'm so thankful for you, just to take the time to talk about your experience and to share some of that insight, because my hope is that it will be hopeful and inspiring for others, that you don't necessarily have to wait to be faced with a circumstance like you've been faced with, to actually choose to lean in, and I just think it's wonderful, because I think it is so easy. It's so easy to view the relationship between parents and children as one of dependence, and then pushing out into independence, and then from that moment, you're sort of chasing down your own train, and yet this, your story just paints a completely different picture, and even the idea that beyond just clearly your parents raised you to be independent. Clearly, but in such a roundabout way, I will just be so fascinated to see what independence looks like again in the future, now that there's been this beautiful period of interdependence, right?
Yeah, me too.
Which is exciting. It's really exciting.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for taking the time to share your story. I hope that the other thing that I think is really lovely is that I hope that from this, people, maybe people who are intimidated by those who are suffering from Alzheimer's, or those who are caring for, I hope maybe people will find that a little bit less intimidating. Because a hug from Martha is, it's a good and beautiful thing. and she has a way of bringing out the music and the smiles. But what I think is lovely is that you also have a way of doing that. And I thank you for the work that you do and for the care that you give to Martha and for bringing your story to the Transformationist today.
Thank you for having me. It was a real pleasure.
Hi, it's Tash, and it's time for the credits. Thanks for joining us on this episode of The Transformationist. Please subscribe, rate, and review this episode wherever you listen to it, and share it with a friend. Visit thetransformationist.org for links to the resources mentioned in this episode and to subscribe to our email updates. You can also share your transformation story with us there, and I would love to hear from you. As always, this episode is produced by Michael Yoder at Truthwork Media. Music is by Hans Van Vliet. For more about me and the transformation work I do, check out the website. This show is proudly made possible by Solar Feeder Consulting.